Hi, fellow tea lovers. Settle in, because we've got a story. I'm Nell.
And I'm Rose, and today we're bringing you the tea.
Across era.
Hey, welcome back.
Welcome back.
It's already December. Oh my goodness.
It is. How was your week of Thanksgiving?
Not bad. Mostly work. The holiday time tends to be my busiest time, so, it's ramping up, but honestly, it wasn't that bad at all.
I went to Colorado. I was in the mountains, and there was a ton of snow.
She sent the prettiest pictures.
Yeah, they were from inside. I'm not a skier, and I haven't snowboarded in a very long time.
The best snow is picturesque through a window when you're very warm inside.
Right. Yeah, so we fly into Denver, and then we take the ski shuttle, because they drop you off at your door.
Yeah, that's super handy.
It is handy. Before we went, I was telling my coworkers where I was going, and they're sending me all these terrifying things, bad traffic, don't drive, roads closed, snowstorm.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was. And so I was I assume these people are experienced. Fingers crossed, this is what they do.
So I know. I was on a really terrifying bus ride once with Scottish bus drivers are a different type of bus driver.
I was going to say, I've only had scary bus experiences in other countries.
Oh no, I've had plenty scary bus experiences in the U.S., but it was mostly passenger-based. The driver was fine.
Definitely.
No, I met some real characters in my Greyhound days. I'd like to think I've aged out of that.
I did go on Greyhound one time. No clue what to expect, and I don't want to do that again.
Yeah, no, it was worthwhile and useful for what I needed it for at the time, but I'm good. As if I wasn't enough of a homebody already.
Right, right.
Well, as happens so often, I was thinking about an entirely different story that I'm going to tell you today. And it's your fault, I will say.
My bad. Not really. I'm interested in this.
I had a perfectly lovely thing that I was putting together, and then Nell sends me an article this morning. It was really interesting. It was brand new research about a topic that is a perennial favorite of historians, which is the disappearance of the two princes in the tower. It's sort of the arch medieval mystery, and
sounds like a fairy tale.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
So I wanted to talk about that today, partially because new research is rare. New research, I guess, that's significant is rare. New research happens all the time. Armchair history is something that I love as a armchair historian myself. I mean, I've got more training than some, but not as much as others. And so I really appreciate how much you can get done just as an interested party. But I think that also really has to be coupled with caution. You don't necessarily have all of the context that somebody that has spent a lot of time studying primary sources may have.
Correct. Especially when it involves things like true crime. Be careful there.
Oh, yeah, because it's easy to get excited. And this is a little bit of a throwback to one of our earliest episodes, Monarchy and True Love, because the reason primarily that this is so interesting beyond all of the historical ripples that the facts of the story created is that people feel so passionately about the emotion of the story. My goodness.
Right before recording this, I was watching a video that Rose was showing me, and people are intense. I love it.
The article is from The Guardian, and we'll put this up on our website, titled "The Murder of the Princes in the Tower Solved at Last, New Bombshell Evidence." And that's how stories about the princes in the tower, I think, always get billed. We've solved it! And it's, we found a really cool piece that points in a certain direction, but there's no solving something that's that old with that little primary information. We'll just put that on the table right now, and it's okay. I noticed one of the contributors that they were referencing was Tracy Borman, and she is one of the curators of the historic royal palaces.
Okay.
But she does quite a few pop-ins and documentaries that I've watched. She was a name that I was familiar with. So that immediately piqued my interest just because she's someone that I consider a trustworthy source right off the bat. So I go on to my streaming site of choice and look up Tracy Borman and immediately get this episode of Medieval Murder Mysteries.
Okay.
Which I highly recommend. Cute show. I don't know if cute's the word that I was looking for there.
Fun.
Super enjoyable.
Informative.
Super fun and informative. So she was a contributor on this episode of Medieval Murder Mysteries in 2015 that was about the princes in the tower. And I started watching that, and I had to show Nell. It made me laugh so much that one of the guys that they were interviewing walks up to the Tower of London in his big leather jacket with the mantle, and with great gravitas talks about Richard III, the most evil king in all of British history. Like, he's got the voice.
The most evil. That's a label.
That's very subjective.
Yes,
and there's a lot of competition.
The Richard III Society, which we touched on in the Monarchy and True Love episode, they're intense. And you know what? You should be.
You should be intense about your passions.
If it doesn't hurt people.
Absolutely. The Henry VII Society has some things to say about that, but I don't know. They don't present themselves with the same amount of outward passion, I guess. Henry VIII is the one that everybody is interested in, so thus Henry VII, I think, gets grandfathered in a lot in people's passion projects about the period, whereas Richard III, that's people like a good redemption story. People like an underdog. Yes. And so for a very long time, Richard III has been a great villain. And a lot of that is because the accounts of the prince's disappearance and of the time in general, a lot of those accounts lean really heavily on the writings of Thomas More.
Okay.
He was one of Henry VIII's tutors growing up, but then he was also his chancellor and eventually, unfortunately, was beheaded for refusing to sign the Act of Succession.
Oh.
Super different story. He wrote Utopia. He's considered a Catholic martyr because he wouldn't sign the Act of Succession, which also declared Henry VIII head of the Church in England.
Oh.
And morally, he couldn't bring himself to do so.
If you haven't read Utopia, I haven't either. But if you watch the movie Ever After, that's her favorite book.
Brilliant quote, absolutely relevant to this day. But he had really, really good reason to vilify Richard III. So there's the first strike against the account. He's working for the guy that killed Richard III and was the last king of England to win it on the tip of a sword.
Dun, dun, dun.
You're going to probably write a fairly favorable account of that guy.
Of course I am. History's written by the winners.
So that's suspect. But what was interesting about this Guardian article is talking about new research that actually reinforces his account, which does not solve it, prove it, what have you, but it's a really interesting, solid piece of evidence, I think, and it originates in a will.
Oh, okay.
And we've talked about wills before. You put the things that you are the most serious about in your will. Those are your last words to this earth.
My dogs.
Right? Your bedclothes in the Middle Ages, as it turns out, is one of the biggest willed items. You never really realize how expensive blankets and things are.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But so we're going to back up a little bit and tell the story of the princes, because I think that the find has more gravitas with.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, why are the princes in the tower stuck in the tower? The story has a ton of origin points, but in all reality, really starts with Henry VI.
Okay.
So we're going to go back a couple generations.
And is this tower the same tower that you can visit in London?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not a tower like I think a tower.
Yeah, it's like a four minaret tower structure with walls in between it. I was laughing at that earlier though, because it's a really jaunty looking piece of architecture to me. Like I don't know, with the domes on the four corners and like the little flags and everything. It looks like something that you would buy as a child's toy and say, "This is a castle."
I would live there.
and it's the scene of all of these horrendous stories.
If given the opportunity to stay, I definitely would.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully something paranormal would happen. But, like, the architecture and design of it, like, I love a cute courtyard.
It's not dark and imposing. Like, maybe, I don't know.
The torture area was, but
well, of course. Yeah, the inside is an entirely different story. But if you're rolling up to that thing, my first thought is, cute.
I know, right?
So Henry VI is really the origin of the whole War of the Roses debacle. Which we talked about a little bit before, but it's worth revisiting. So he was crowned in 1422 originally, and his major problem was likely a lifelong debilitating disease, either a mental incapacity or a physical incapacity that then affected his mental abilities.
Okay.
He was always a sickly king. He went through a period where he didn't speak. He was not a military mind, and there's a lot we could go into there, but suffice to say he was not effective, and his wife, Margaret of Anjou, was essentially ruling on his behalf.
Okay.
He lost French territories for the most part, basically finished up John Lackland's job.
Whoops.
Yeah. Had a son, but just he wasn't someone that projected, the strength of the future of the monarchy.
Okay.
And you have the York cousins who are also descended from Edward III. So Edward III is where everybody kind of gets their claim from in the whole War of the Roses debate. And because Edward, the Black Prince, died
of dysentery,
he surrendered himself.
Yep.
But because he died, the succession went to a child rather than to John of Gaunt, who was the third son of Edward III.
Right.
And really, in terms of strength, it should have gone to him. But in terms of the rules of succession, it went to Richard II.
Right. Okay. So
I trust you.
If it was today, let's just say William is king, and something happens. I'm not wishing this on anyone.
No, this is purely for an example.
Yes. Okay. So something happens, and the crown goes to his son George, who's still a kid. And then some people are like, no, dude, it should have went to Harry.
Right. This is very similar to what would happen in that situation.
In this situation, I feel like Harry's all, get away from me.
Right. I don't think he'd accept it. Well, I mean, who knows, maybe, but...
If he did, it would be hilarious from the point of view of my American self.
Right. It's funny when your taxes aren't paying for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but that's a good example. Instead of the crown going to the adult brother that already has kids and could secure the dynasty very easily, they follow the rules of succession rather than possibly the spirit, and give it to a child. And I think that's relevant. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I think that's relevant to Richard III's decision-making process, is knowing that history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I am going to skip quite a few bits of the story between Edward III and Henry VI. Because
if you're riveted by this, number one, let us know. And number two, check our library page for the War of the Roses books.
Yeah, Con Eagledon did a really great series of historic fiction about the time period that I think, it's fiction, so obviously there's liberties taken, but I think he, as a historian, takes reasonable liberties.
Okay.
And I did really enjoy the account. Plus, he is a dear that always puts family trees and maps.
Oh, yes.
In the beginning of his books, just bless your heart.
Yes.
I really appreciate that. Everybody should do it. So the mess of the Black Prince dying and children inheriting and people being deposed, and then all of that trickles down to Henry VI, who is king by the technical rules. He's the Lancastrian side. They're the ones that, however you feel morally about the situation, came up aces because of people following the rules of succession mostly. The Yorkist side, I don't know, to me they always represented the jocks, the sports guys. They're, I mean that's a weird impression.
Fighters.
They're the fighters. They're the ones that had technically as strong a claim as the Lancastrian side, but were more effective martially, and to be honest, more effective in terms of just running the country.
Well,
they had the practical claim, whereas the Lancastrians had the moral claim.
Okay.
And you can fight me on that, and you might be right, but that's just the impression that I've always had of the two sides. And so the York side comes up and says, we're pretty sick of having this ineffectual king that he's too religious, and he's losing us the territories, and he doesn't even speak some of the times. He's going to die with this one sickly kid as an heir, and then we're stuck with this French chick telling us what to do. Margaret of Anjou. We're not doing that. No. Crown is mine. Give it up. And so there's, that's most of the Wars of the Roses is the back and forth between these two families. So we trickle all the way down to the end of that. Edward IV takes the crown a couple of times. There's back and forth, but when the dust settles, he's essentially the almost winner of the Wars of the Roses. He marries Elizabeth Woodville, and she's very unpopular. So she's a commoner. She's a widow. She's already been married before. And for some reason, this flower of English knighthood that has, wrestled the country away from its ineffectual overlords has, instead of making a dynastic marriage choice, picked up this chick on the side of the road. I'm totally quoting the Philippa Gregory show. It's fun. Just met this chick on the random and decided that she's the love of his life and will be the mother of his children. And
absolutely not. There's no marrying for love in this.
No, that's just not a thing at all. What do you mean? He's clearly bewitched. She's a witch. Yeah. She's a witch.
You can only marry for love in Bridgerton.
Apparently. Which, that becomes even more of a problem later, because when Edward IV is king, he's young, he's virile, he's got a ton of kids, he's got a beautiful wife, he is English knighthood personified, and he's going to save the monarchy. He can marry anybody he wants. Elizabeth Woodville can do whatever she wants, basically, because she has the best protector in the world.
Yep.
Who then dies.
Oh, man.
Again, this is the short version. This is just to give you context about the kids. So at this point, they were the perfect royal family. He's a strong, knightly king. She's, the fertile, beautiful lady, has managed to produce an heir and a spare, and then a bunch of little girls to marry off for land or money.
Nice.
They're the perfect family. They're what you were asking for as a medieval king.
I feel like Gaston from Beauty and the Beast is so into this right now.
Yeah, but then, of course, never works out that way. Life isn't fair. Edward IV sickens and dies. So when he's on his deathbed, he tells his brother Richard, who is the only one left out of the mess. Their younger brother possibly died in a vat of Malmsey wine.
Wow.
Just a fun, maybe apocryphal fact. But anyway, so his brother's the only one in the family left, and he's like, you have to take care of my kids. You need to make sure that my son becomes king. We've all worked for this. Our entire family for generations back has worked for this. You need to make sure that this continues.
Yeah.
And he trusts that his brother is going to do that.
I hope that if I was in his brother's shoes, the people who loved me and trusted me that way would not be let down. I would not let them down. Mostly because being the ruler sounds awful.
Yeah. So Edward IV dies. And for a little while, Richard looks like he's going to play ball. It's a pretty short while. He immediately snaps up the two princes and puts them in the tower. That's not that weird initially, because it was tradition for any king before he's crowned to spend the few days running up to it in the tower. There's luxurious apartments.
Yeah, that part makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he had to have people in his ear instantly.
Absolutely. So that's why he's the primary suspect for the disappearance of the boys. So he brings them to the tower and, obviously we're going to crown you. And then it's, backs it off a little bit, like, well, I'm just going to take this over because you're 12 and you don't know how to do it. So I'll just take care of these things for you. Let Uncle do it. Let Uncle do it.
Yeah,
and
I'm not even going to teach you. Just let me do it.
I'll just take care of this for you. And slowly over time, it becomes fairly apparent that Richard likes being king, has no intention of giving it up.
How seriously do the people take him?
He's a mediumly effective ruler, but I don't think he ever had the same type of support that Edward IV did. I think that it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that he wants to take over the succession. But then in looking back at the history of the last several generations of succession, he had seen the absolute disaster of a child king.
Yep.
So I feel like it's almost a little bit like my sympathy for Henry VIII wanting a son so badly after watching all of this, because he saw exactly what succession wars could do.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's discountable that Richard also had seen what a regency could do. It doesn't make disappearing your nephews a moral decision, but it does sort of explain a little bit of why that might be desirable.
Right, and you probably also have people telling you things like, this is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you got him out here teaching him what to do, anyone else could get to him the same way I'm getting to you.
Exactly. If we had just given the adult brother the throne rather than the child of the dead brother, it's the same situation as the death of Edward III. And so he's got a choice. He can live the same circle of history over again and possibly start a whole nother dynastic war,
right?
Or he can make a decision. Again, I'm not agreeing with him, but this is a very reasonable thought process.
Agree.
Yeah. Richard III takes the interesting step of delegitimizing all of his brother's children, which you could apparently do. People back and forth. It's Henry VIII, legitimized and delegitimized his children several times over. But this is before the king is the head of the church, and they're just basically legally saying Richard found a cleric that was willing to find evidence, quote unquote, that Elizabeth Woodville was never actually married to Edward IV. So that's that final kick in the pants for Elizabeth.
Rude.
We hate that Woodville chick. She's a witch. All of her kids are bastards. We don't have to worry about them. You're king.
So all the other children were girls?
The heir and the spare were the only living male issue. They had quite a few kids, but several died as children. I think one when he was like 2, one when she was 14. There were 2 coffins found in Edward IV's tomb in, I want to say, the 18th century. During a renovation, they accidentally broke into the tomb, and there were 2 coffins that were originally assigned to 2 of the children that it was documented had died in childhood, but then their names were found elsewhere in the chapel.
Oh,
and so
okay.
their remains had already been accounted for, and so there are 2 possible coffins in the actual tomb of Edward and Elizabeth that have never been fully investigated. The royal family controls these vaults.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of permissions that nobody's really willing to give in order to really fully exhume and examine the remains. So at the time of Edward IV's passing, there's only 3 living children,
Okay.
which are the 2 boys and then Elizabeth of York. She's going to come up in a second.
Okay.
So Richard delegitimizes all of his brother's children, and then the princes are just really never heard of again. There's no official announcement. There's no attempt to explain it. They're just gone.
Right. They're too old to just be like, here's family elsewhere,
Right.
adopt them.
Nope, those are witnesses. Just as an aside, how embarrassing would it be if Richard was totally on the level and then they, like, caught the flu? In that side universe where he was like, he's going to be the best king and I'm going to raise him and be the best uncle in the whole wide world. And, kids were a little bit hard to keep alive in the Middle Ages.
True.
Like got bit by a rat. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I killed him. I'm so sorry. Like, how embarrassing would that be?
I know, right?
So Richard declares himself to be the king because the king-to-be is illegitimate. And then the Battle of Bosworth happens. Henry VII invades from France, kills Richard, and assumes the throne. One of his first acts is to re-legitimize all of Edward IV's children.
Including Elizabeth of York?
Yes, ma'am.
Who's the only one alive.
Who is the only one left alive, and
Jeez.
marries her, and thus solidifies his claim to the throne, which is why Henry VIII is considered the successor to both lines.
Boom.
That's
baby.
why the Tudor rose is the white rose and the red together. Yeah. And so that actually brings up the interesting second theory that we were watching earlier, which is that possibly Henry VII ordered the death of the princes from afar. So that's a little bit of a harder stretch. So at the time that the princes were going missing, he was not in the country. Henry VII, otherwise known as Henry Beaufort.
Where was he?
He was in France. He had been exiled because his claim was basically the last thread of the Lancastrian claim.
Okay.
And so it was going to be a little bit deathy to stay in the country. He needed to move on.
Okay.
But he had supporters. He had factions. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was like the stage mom to end all stage moms. Because it was her bloodline that gave him his claim.
Okay.
And it was through several kind of questionable sources, really questionable only, meaning ran through ladies and commoners. Gasp.
Yes.
But she worked it. She made alliances. She did everything she could to see her son on the throne, and succeeded. I think the portrayals she gets in movies these days are it's a little sad, because she always kind of gets put out as this like frosty religious, like, well, we deserve this because we deserve it. She's a Karen in most of the depictions that I've seen her. And she was a shrewd politician.
But she's a woman.
But she's a woman, so she must be she-wolfy.
Yeah, she's terrible.
Right.
She's not a boss. She's not a CEO.
She's just
a
a
terrible
lady,
woman.
descended from ladies, and just all ladies all over.
How dare she have an opinion?
So the whole time that Richard is trying to solidify his rule, Henry is trying to gather support from France, and he's succeeding. And so it's not impossible that from France he could have hired somebody that had access. And it makes sense politically, because they had been disenfranchised and they'd been taken out of the succession.
Yeah.
And that really worked for him. That's fewer competitors. But
absolutely.
In order for a marriage with Elizabeth of York to become a tool rather than a liability, he would have had to make sure that her brothers were already dead.
Yeah.
If he married her without re-legitimizing the line, it meant nothing.
Exactly.
But if he re-legitimized the line with living male heirs, that's a huge problem. And so
it works out great.
Whether or not he was in charge of the murder, it super worked in his favor.
Yes, it did.
So the discovery that the Guardian article was talking about, and I really do need to reference the guy.
What's this evidence?
So what it was the guy that I think Thomas More's account accuses of actually committing the murder was Richard III's Master of the Horse. He was a trusted ally of Richard III's.
That's a really great job title.
Master of the Horse. Master of the Horse. It sounds like it's the beginning of a musical. So the Master of the Horse, his name was Sir James Tyrrell.
Okay.
And so in Thomas More's version of the story, he was the one that was accused of committing the actual murder, having been hired by Richard III.
Okay.
And so in the will of a Lady Margaret Capel, so this was discovered by Tim Thornton of the Royal Historical Society and University of Huddersfield.
Okay.
And in the will of Lady Margaret Capel, she's the sister-in-law of James Tyrrell.
Okay.
Bequeathed a gold chain in her will that was reputed to belong to Edward V.
Oh.
That is the first piece of even reference to physical evidence of their existence after their death. Because jewelry, that's, jewelry and bedding, you're going to will that to your everyone. That's the kind of thing that would be stolen off of a kid before he's dumped under a stair. That's the kind of thing that a king in waiting would be keeping with him even in captivity.
So, two things. First, did she have that written in her will?
She did.
It was believed to belong to him?
Not believed, just that belonged to Edward V.
Oh, okay. Second, dumping the kids under a stairwell? What?
So in Charles II's reign, during renovations, there were two sets of remains found under a staircase that have always been billed as the two princes. They were examined at the time and appeared to have marks of having been smothered. I mean, this is 130 years afterward.
So probably like compression around like your nasal underneath the cartilage area, the bone. Okay.
Right. And it's skeletal remains. Like, it's a long time afterward, but there is velvet attached to the remains while they're found. So that speaks to a richer victim. But they were buried quite carelessly with other animal bones, like chicken bones, things like that. And so, it suggests a dump site. And I mean, that's a really pretty good piece of evidence that that's probably them.
Yeah.
So those remains were reinterred together in an urn and placed in Westminster Abbey. So this chain even being referenced, none of their possessions were referenced after they disappeared. They literally disappeared. That's why it's a story that is ripe for paranormal interpretations. Do you remember that Goosebumps book?
Yes. So where did she get this jewel from? Do we know?
This is the only reference to it.
Wow.
So, but what the conjecture is that if James Tyrrell was the one that actually orchestrated the disappearance, then he is the most likely person to have ended up with anything cool they had on them.
Or he was charged with disposing of the bodies?
Also possible. He was also executed for his purported participation in their disappearance by Henry VII.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So, he's hired by one king, unceremoniously fired by the next.
Richard III did all this for nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he was going to lose the Battle of Bosworth anyway.
Man.
Didn't know that.
True. Hindsight's 2020.
And what's so cool is that this is still such a hot topic. This is still such a debate. I don't want to say like last year sometime, there was another headline extremely like it. We've blown this case wide open. The Princes in the Tower solved. That was far less substantial evidence and slightly disappointing to me. This to me feels much more solid and documentable and still kind of points in the direction of, I think that Richard did it. I think he had the best access personally, but
best access, biggest motive. Although, I don't know, those days were wild.
Hey, they still are. We just have different players.
That's so true. Anyways, happy December. Welcome.
Have a lovely week.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.